Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to Bard Graduate Center. My name is Nadia Rivers. I'm the coordinator of public programs, engagement, and education. And I am delighted to welcome you to today's program called Histories of Lead Activism in America. I am a Black woman with dark brown hair. I am wearing black cat-eye glasses and a gray sweater. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land we are hosting this event from. I say this acknowledgement aware that these kinds of statements can be misused as stand-ins for actual decolonization work, which is something for us to bear in mind as we go forward in our ongoing commitment to accountability, reparation, and equity. Many cities and institutions in America were founded on the exclusion, harm, and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those whose land, Mannahatta, from which this event is hosted. The land of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City is the unceded territory of the Lenape, Merritt, Canarsie, Matinecock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal trade lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples who currently call New York City home. If you'd like to learn more about the land you are on, you can click the link that will be posted in the chat shortly. In addition, I would like to acknowledge those ancestors who did not arrive on these lands of their own free will and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundation of our lives. I would like to also introduce and thank Shirley and Selena from Progromo ASL, who will be providing American Sign Language interpretation for today's event. If you would like to enable closed captioning, there is a CC in the lower right-hand side of your screen. You can click that and automated captions will appear. This event will be recorded and posted on YouTube in a few weeks. We invite you to submit questions during the program using the Q&A function. If you would prefer to speak your question, you can raise your hand. And finally, BGC programs and events. Tomorrow, we're having an event called Majolica Speaks. It is a verbal description event for participants with low vision. There's a follow-up to that tour on December 8th. And on Monday, we'll have a Majolica poetry reading where poets will share their inspiration and poetry commissioned by BGC for the Majolica Mania exhibition. We'll also be sharing links to the Majolica Mania catalog. It is a beautiful catalog made up of 3 volumes that covers objects in the show and objects that are just in the catalog. It's really fantastic, as well as our digital exhibition of Majolica Mania. It's really robust, a fantastic site. So please check that out to take a look at the objects and learn about the history of Majolica. We'll also be posting links to timed entry to visit our gallery in person and see the Majolica Mania show before it closes in January. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Richard Mizelle is an associate professor of history at the University of Houston. Benjamin Clark is a PhD student in IUPUI's American Studies program with a concentration in applied anthropology. To read the full bios of our speakers, you can click the link that will be posted in the chat for today's event. And just the format of today's event, Benjamin Clark will start us off with a presentation followed by Dr. Mizelle. They will respond to one another and then we'll open up for questions. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Can we go up one more screen? There we go. We'll start with that one. As Nadia mentioned, my name is Ben Clark. I'm a student at IUPUI in the PhD program. Thank you, Nadia, for allowing me to be here, and to Dr. Mizelle and the Bard Graduate Center. I'm really pleased to be a part of this conversation tonight. As she mentioned, I'm a student at IUPUI. If you're not familiar with the university, it's the Indianapolis campus of Indiana University. We're the largest urban research university in the state. And I'm a student in the American Studies program, and this is a program that's designed to create publicly engaged scholars, not necessarily future faculty, but scholars who are intensely engaged in doing community-based work. And that's exactly what I'm doing and what I'm here to talk to you about this evening. And also, I'm a researcher at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, the IAHI. And there I'm part of a research project called the Anthropocene Household. So it takes this idea of the Anthropocene, this age of humans, this idea that humans are a geological force on the planet, and kind of flips it upside down and looks at it, these global scale concepts and processes, and looks at it from the household level, the community level, to see how these things like climate change, environmental change, are being experienced at the household level, at the community level. And my particular research interest involves environmental racism and how these meta processes cause and contribute to my environmental racism. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. If we can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about kind of set the tone a little bit for what I'm going to be talking about this evening. This is a quote from Dr. Laura Polito. She's a human geographer, which is adjacent to my disciplines of history and anthropology. She's a professor at University of Oregon. She's been doing fantastic scholarship for the last 2 or 3 decades on environmental racism. If you read any piece of scholarship on environmental racism, it had better cite Laura Polito. But this really fabulous quote, I just wanted to share with you all to kind of let you know where I'm coming from and set the tone for the rest of the conversation that I'm going to be having. Environmental hazards follow along racial lines, but also many of the meta processes that have contributed to the Anthropocene, such as industrialization, urbanization, capitalism, are racialized, end quote. So just with that in mind, think about these large-scale processes, industrialization, urbanization, capitalism, as ways that environmental racism is enacted and continued. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about a community within Indianapolis called Martindale Brightwood that faced down their lead pollution issue and how they dealt with it and what the results were and where things are now. And then I want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about the theoretical framework that I use in my research and what I think it can be useful in terms of initiating activism, communities acting on their own behalf when they are faced with environmental contaminants and environmental injustices. And then I want to circle back and talk again about the Anthropocene Household Project and the kind of community engaged work that we're doing to address lead pollution in the city of Indianapolis. So Martindale Brightwood, it was these 2 separate communities, Martindale and Brightwood, were started in the mid-late 19th century outside the city limits of Indianapolis. But of course, as the city grew, they annexed these two communities, and they became sort of this single Martindale Brightwood community annexed by the city within the city limits of Indianapolis. And it's primarily residential through its entire history, but there are factories and other kind of industrial operations dotted throughout this residential area. Of course, potential polluters, these factories and so forth. During the 1950s and 60s, Martindale and Brightwood underwent significant demographic shifts that you see happening all over the country, where the white working class residents living in the urban core leave for the suburbs, and neighborhoods are then primarily shifting toward majority Black residents, and Martindale Brightwood is no exception. So by 1960, Black residents accounted for about half of Martindale Brightwood's population, and by the present day, that number is about 90%. So during this period of demographic shift in the mid 20th century, the 1940s to the 1960s, this company, American Lead Corporation, operated there within this residential neighborhood of Martindale Brightwood. They were a lead smelter. They recycled car batteries. So it's really nasty business that they're up to there, leaving behind a lot of toxins. In the mid 60s, the factory had a fire, and the company just kind of abandoned the site, leaving behind buildings and lead slag piles, kind of the leavings of lead smelting process. So in 1971, several of the buildings were removed, the lead slag piles were removed, but it still left behind, significant levels of toxic lead in the environment there. And it just remained this kind of vacant brownfield for a period of about 15 years until the mid 1980s, when a company wanted to buy up the site and start operating there. It was a concrete company or a cement manufacturer. And it was only then that the EPA got involved and started testing the site to see what the lead levels were there. Not, mind you, that period of, a decade and a half where it was just a brownfield sitting there polluting the environment. But when a company wanted to come in there and operate, that's when the EPA got involved and started testing. And it turns out that the lead count was above 3,000 parts per million, which is just an astronomically large figure. It's extremely dangerous. 3,000 parts per million in where this lead facility operated. Now, for a frame of reference, the threshold, like the top end, is usually around 80 parts per million. That's what's considered okay, is 80 parts per million. So we're thinking 3,000 parts per million in the middle of this residential area. That's extremely dangerous. But even with this information, nothing really happened. No one engaged the community to say, hey, there's some lead in your environment. We need to do something about it. No one told the people living there that their community was polluted with lead. Nothing was done to clean it up or remediate the problem at all. So you can kind of see where the problem is starting to form. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks. This is a photograph of Elizabeth Gore. She's one of the long-term residents of the neighborhood. She's still living there now. She's one of the key activists. We'll talk about her in a moment, but I wanted to step back and talk around, it was 2004, 2005, a church in the neighborhood wanted to construct a new building. And in the process, they discovered that there was lead in the soil. And, the neighborhood residents didn't really know that that would be an issue. They thought it was maybe just isolated to where American Lead operated. But it turns out it was much more widespread throughout the community. And of course, this alarmed a lot of people. And so the church's pastor got involved and started confronting local government leaders and calling out those with political power to do something about it. And people didn't necessarily like that. He was lifting up his voice and calling out the powers that be to do something about this lead problem. But through this kind of confrontational approach, he was able to forge relationships and start to get things moving in the right direction. Otherwise, nothing would have happened. I know it's sort of counterfactual, but I think it's easy to imagine that nothing would have happened even today if it hadn't started with this pastor and with the work of Elizabeth Gore. As I said, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, who was instrumental in starting this neighborhood environmental justice collaborative that she was part of. And I had the privilege of doing an oral history interview with Mrs. Gore, and just learning about what her experiences were in living in this Martindale Brightwood neighborhood and doing her environmental justice activism. And you can see from the quote there, people didn't really know, but they learned later after the fact that the company just closed up shop and dumped lead. They left behind all this lead pollution in the soil, but didn't do anything about it. But what she was involved in doing with this EJ collaborative was building capacity. Residents, neighbors, people in the community started to learn about what they can do, and they started to understand the issue, and it started to kind of build this momentum toward taking action. And that's when the EPA got involved again, because people were holding their feet to the fire, saying, you need to do something about this. And so that's when the EPA came back and started doing more testing, and this area was declared a Superfund site. And that means that it freed up federal money to flow to this community to do remediation, to clean up the soil. And so what happened was between 2005 and 2007, at around 220 properties, they dug up people's yards. About a foot or two of soil was removed and replaced with clean dirt. So if you can imagine, you get like a yard replacement because it's so polluted with lead, and they were able to target certain areas where this was a problem because it met a certain threshold or something. I don't know exactly their method for deciding that, but these 220 properties were targeted to have this soil replacement done. So that 48,000 tons of lead contaminated soil were removed from properties and taken to a rural landfill, which I think is probably another issue for another day. And so after that, the EPA came back and tested again, but didn't do anything about it. Nonprofits got involved, the university got involved and started doing testing. The EPA came back in 2014 and did more tests and realized that the problem was a lot more extensive than they first knew. I think they started testing some different properties than before, rather than the ones they had been testing previously, and discovered that the problem was a lot more widespread than they even realized. And this was probably due to periodic flooding, and then that would spread the polluted soil throughout the area. That's probably the most likely reason why it was so widespread throughout the neighborhood. But there are other reasons. The lead pollution, lead particulates end up in the air and get spread around through various means. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So in 2016, the EPA came back and did this yard replacement, removing 1 or 2 feet of soil at more than 100 more properties. So we're talking, 325 or so properties in this kind of small neighborhood had their soil replaced because it was so toxic with lead. And at this point, Elizabeth Gore was interviewed for a local news story about it. There were a lot of news stories about it, but this one in particular had a very telling quote from Mrs. Gore in it. And she says, quote, "We're very concerned that there are still high levels of lead in our soils more than 10 years after the initial cleanup. How many children grew up playing in the soil thinking it was safe and it wasn't?" And so I think, end quote, that's such a really, really telling quote. Like, people are living their lives, whole generations of people have lived there in this lead polluted environment, and nothing was done about it until this grassroots community effort held the powers to account, held their feet to the fire to get something done. And so and the only reason they were able to do that is because they could pinpoint a specific culprit, this American lead, and tie it to industrial activities. Sometimes there's lead pollution that comes from other sources that you can't necessarily tie to a specific actor, a specific company. So that it becomes more problematic to get the scale of resources you need, like $6 million from the EPA to replace people's yards. So with that in mind, I want to go on to the next slide and talk about the theoretical framework that I'm using that I think helps to explain environmental racism, but also kind of helps, I think, activists, those wanting to take action, understand where to direct their energy, if that makes sense. So I already introduced you to Laura Polito, leading scholar on environmental racism. And a few years ago, she wrote a series of 3 scholarly articles called The Geographies of Race and Ethnicity. And in one of these 3 pieces, she laid out her theoretical framework, talking about not just environmental racism as a monolith, but rather environmental racisms. She describes white privilege, white supremacy, and settler colonialism. So white privilege, we see the systemic racism that allows white populations to leave the urban core and move to the suburbs, for example. Martindale Brightwood is a great example of this. If you recall, I talked about in the mid-20th century, as this lead smelting factory was operating there, the white population was able to leave, but that meant because of the social forces at play, the Black population remained living there. We have lots of different factors involved, but think of residential segregation and school segregation and redlining, even though maybe by this point Hulk wasn't, the Homeowners Loan Corporation wasn't conducting redlining per se, but we still, even today, there was a story in the news in Indianapolis over the summer about banks still carrying out redlining, but it just looks a little different now. It's redlining 2.0. So these sorts of social forces, what I'm describing, are at play, and lead pollution is a great example, and in Martindale Brightwood, I think, illustrates that point really well. White supremacy and environmental racism. And the way Polito describes it, It's governments and corporations collaborating to maintain regulatory non-compliance. So governments and corporations working together to not hold each other accountable. Governments aren't doing their regulatory duty to make corporations obey the law when it comes to environmental regulations, protecting humans and the environment. So the verbiage that's used often in literature is differential protection and unequal enforcement. And I don't have time to go into it, and it's outside the purview of this conversation, but there's an example I'm researching also in Indianapolis where there's a groundwater contamination site in the city in another historically Black neighborhood that was ignored for a long time, and now government agencies are involved in the cleanup, but it's taking just an extraordinarily long time to get anything done on it. And in an oral history interview with one of the project managers for the government, he was asked, who are your clients? Who are your customers? Who are you serving? And he responded that his clients, his customers are the companies and their lawyers, their representatives. That's who he's serving. He did not say that he was serving the interests of the people in the polluted neighborhoods. That's not who he's serving. He's serving the interests of the companies who did the polluting. And that, to me, is problematic. And I think really, really illustrates the point of the way that white supremacy creates the system that we're all working in order to maintain the status quo. So the third one that we're not exactly talking about today, but I think it's still relevant, is settler colonialism that Polito describes. And of course, the initial taking of the land from indigenous peoples is an enormously egregious act of environmental racism, of course. But we're still living with the legacy of that, of course. But there are tribal nations today dealing with other instances of environmental racism. The Dakota Access Pipeline, if you all remember that, is a really great example of that. So that's it about the theoretical framework, and I hope it makes sense to think of these different environmental racisms. They're not maybe all acting independently. Sometimes there's a Venn diagram and we have more than one acting at the same time. But I think understanding this can help those interested in taking action kind of understand where to direct their energy. So if we could go on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the Anthropocene Household Project that I'm a part of. As I mentioned, there's a lot of qualitative ethnographic sort of research that we're doing, oral histories, focus groups, participant observation, which is a big part of it. And we're hoping to foreground the voices of those living through these issues. But another key component of what we're doing is this citizen science project. We've partnered with the School of Science at IUPUI to provide free, user-friendly lead testing kits to communities that have been impacted by lead pollution. And so we're partnering with local churches, local nonprofits to distribute these kits to people in these impacted areas. And you can see they can test, they have vials there. I don't know if you can see clearly in the photograph, but there are vials for testing your water. There are cotton balls. You can do a swipe and test the dust in your home, or you can put the dust from your vacuum cleaner in there. Kind of gross, but it's an effective way to test for lead in your dust. And the other one is soil samples from your yard, and the instructions pinpoint different areas in your yard where you need to test, where it's more likely you're going to find lead there if there is lead at all. And so that's what this kit is able to do. And then we are able to anonymously provide people with their results. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll show you what the lead result report looks like. And so it's not just a simple binary, yes, lead, no, there's no lead. It's we provide people with actual specific numbers of the parts per million and what the threshold is and what's safe and what's not. And so, green is good, red is bad, and orange and yellow in between kind of lets people have a better idea of what they're dealing with in soil, dust, and water. That way, short of large scale government action, short of the EPA spending $6 million to remediate the problem, people can take this information and act on their own behalf. because as I said, it's harder when you can't pinpoint the source necessarily to get resources to deal with it. But we provide people with simple ideas, like if you have bare soil in your yard, cover it with grass seed or mulch, or plant some flowers there. Or if you're going to garden, use a raised bed. And there are simple, cost-effective ways to build a raised bed to do some gardening in your backyard. Or if you have water in or lead coming out of your tap water, you can get a filter, and we're working on being able to provide some filters to people, and other sorts of ideas that are inexpensive and quick fixes for folks. Also encouraging people to go to their local healthcare provider and get a test if they're concerned, to see if their child has lead in their system, because the sooner you act, the better when it comes to lead poisoning. So one final thing I wanted to show you, and then I'll be quiet and let Dr. Mizelle take over. If we could go on to the next slide. The last thing is, I mentioned we're partnering with the School of Science, and part of what their project is, it's this global project with universities from all over the world that are doing something called Map My Environment. And it's to identify lead hotspots all over the world. And Indianapolis, because of our affiliation with the university, is one of the spots that they're highlighting. And I don't know if you can tell from looking at the map, but it shows where the lead hotspots are. And they're all kind of in this urban core area of the city, where, the bright red, the dark red, that's where the lead hotspots are. And so that's what this data from the Anthropocene household lead testing kits goes into this Map My Environment, Map My Indy website, so that we can identify, these scientists can identify lead hotspots all over the globe and start to address the problem more directly. So that is what I have for you this evening. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being a great audience. And I'll pass it on to Dr. Mizelle now.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really enjoyed that. I think my presentation is a great segue to what you were describing. In some ways, placing a historical framework on some of these important questions that you're talking about, particularly around this question of sort of communities and individuals sort of mobilizing for their own communities. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Richardzzell. I am Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston. My research revolves around the history of medicine, race, environment, and technology. My first book was a history of the 1927 Mississippi River flood, which prior to Katrina was the worst environmental disaster in American history. Currently working on two book projects. One is a history of race and diabetes from the turn of the 20th century through until now through Katrina, but as you might imagine, it's going through COVID, through the current COVID-19 pandemic. And also finishing an edited collection, Oxford Handbook of American Medical History, some of the essays sort of dealing with these sort of issues of environmental contaminants. So I want to thank initially off the bat, Emily Riley and Nadia Rivers and the Bard Graduate Center for this wonderful invitation. I want to thank particularly Emily and Nadia for enduring my long delays in responding to their emails, but I very much appreciate them. So this presentation comes out of an exhibition that I guess curated for the National Library of Medicine called "This Lead is Killing Us: A History of Citizens Fighting Lead Poisoning in Their Communities." And the impetus for this exhibition was to really sort of document in 6 very brief banners some of the ways in which communities have mobilized around this idea of lead and lead poisoning in their communities, but also thinking about some of the sort of questions of sort of exposure and environmental racism that have occurred from the turn of the 20th century, really through the civil rights movement. The current COVID-19 pandemic has delayed this traveling banner exhibition from going on the road, but such is life in this world of COVID. And I hope that one day in the next half a year or year, that this traveling banner exhibition will make its way around the country to various archives, libraries, hospitals, medical centers, et cetera. So, so building on what Ben has said, we have known of the dangers of lead and lead poisoning for quite some time. Scholars in the United States have written about the dangers of lead poisoning since at least the late 19th century, if not before, and probably earlier than that in European centers. Scholars, public health officials have written about the dangers of lead in the construction trades, caused by the early 20th century in gasoline and paint. And it was targeted by the growing occupational and industrial health movement of the early 20th century. Think of people like Alice Hamilton, who worked in the sort of Hull House and became interested in sort of this question of lead in industrial workers, particularly around immigrant communities working in inner city Chicago and industrial Chicago and other cities as well. These issues will continue to sort of come to the forefront in various ways. One of the ways was, of course, in 1924 with the Deepwater, New Jersey DuPont plant, in which 5 workers died from exposure to tetraethyl gasoline in this market where they were producing leaded gasoline for public consumption. 5 died, and many others became ill in what was known as the House of Butterflies by workers and their families, sort of signaling that people working in this particular plant and others were experiencing vomiting, nausea, and ending up in the hospital because of this exposure to lead. But it also played out in a number of different ways as well. We'll go to the next slide, please. It would also become known as the Depression disease. In 1932, a Baltimore public health official began to notice a number of African-American residents coming into clinics suffering from lead poisoning, and most of them lived in a 7-block radius of East Baltimore. And what he discovered was that many of them had become exposed to lead through batteries, through storage batteries that had been discarded illegally in their communities. So particularly by the 1930s and 1940s, as automobiles were becoming more prominent, these sort of batteries were in high usage, such as the battery that you see here. Once the battery was depleted, these battery companies would take out the metal casings to refurbish and possibly regenerate these storage batteries. These storage batteries were surrounded by a wooden casing that they would discard or sell to poor people in low-income communities, or just simply discard to get rid of them. The problem with these wooded battery casings was that they were infused with lead. And so unknowingly, unwittingly, in the dead of winter, in places like Chicago, in places like Baltimore, New York City, residents would use these wooded battery casings to heat their apartments. Or because it was a sort of nicely compartmentalized box, they might set fire to the box as a way of cooking if they did not have access to gas. But in doing so, in setting fire to this leaded sort of soaked wood, they were releasing sort of fumes into the air and poisoning themselves and other individuals around them. And this would become known within certain circles as the Depression disease, because it was brought about by poverty. Another well-known case was the Bruco Battery Company, which illegally deposited some 500 casings in a Chicago neighborhood in the dead of winter. Again, not knowing the dangers of using this wood. Many residents in Chicago use this wood for heat, for warmth, and for cooking. And many of them became ill because of this. And the battery company was sued by residents, And eventually, it was determined that the battery company was at fault and they could no longer illegally store or dump those casings into Black communities. But this highlights then a sort of long battle, a question of sort of environmental racism that Ben is describing, but also we see in the literature, particularly within the burgeoning civil rights movement as well. Next slide, please. So this issue of civil rights and lead would become an issue by the 1950s and 1960s. As many of these low-income communities were being built in places like Chicago and New York City, most, if not all of them, were painted with leaded paint. And so the lead industry would say that this is a housing issue, and the housing industry would say that no, this is a lead issue. So no one wanted to take responsibility, but ultimately the lead industry and the housing industry would blame the residents themselves, essentially arguing that their community, their environment was an outgrowth of their inherent biological inferiority, which was sort of a common refrain, sort of racialized medicine in the early 20th century and throughout. So, at this time, you see lead and lead poisoning becoming a racially and economically charged issue, but you're also sort of seeing more sort of focus on lead and lead poisoning. Which is to say that sort of one of the arguments that historians make, of course, is that by the 1940s, with the advent of penicillin, that this sort of moves us less into a discussion of sort of acute, deadly sort of epidemics and pandemics, but thinking more about sort of the long-term chronic diseases, i.e. cancer, or sort of lead poisoning, diabetes. Of course, scholars more recently have sort of troubled this clear sort of break between sort of chronic disease and acute epidemic disease. But as the argument goes, by the 1940s, we begin to think more about sort of the chronicity in medicine and sort of thinking about these questions of how we might sort of frame sort of chronic disease within our public health infrastructure. So whereas in the early 20th century, for example, much of the conversation might have revolved around sort of vomiting and nausea and some of the more immediate acute aspects or manifestations of lead poisoning. By the 1960s, you begin to see more and more conversations around lead as a chronic issue, and particularly coming from the early part of the 20th century, the vulnerability of children. So if children are vulnerable to lead, and this is a chronic disease, so now we're thinking about the long-term implications of lead exposure for the next 30, 40, 50 years in terms of, subclinical impacts of lead, how it impacts their ability to learn, sort of retention, sort of behavioral problems, sort of other questions of sort of its long-term chronicity in terms of other chronic diseases. So you begin to see, some of these ideas manifesting in the 1950s and 1960s. Next slide, please. And one aspect of the civil rights movement that I want us to consider here, of course, is that we know of the large organizations, the NAACP, SCLC, Black Panther Party even. But an important part of the civil rights movement were the local organizations that sort of mobilized around particular issues. And the issue of lead poisoning was no different. As you see this sort of broader sort of narrative or conversation occurring at the national level, for example, Jack Newfield, the well-known journalist for the Village Voice, argued in 1969 that some 30,000, roughly 30,000, children were unknowingly impacted by lead exposure. And so, as a result of this and before, local organizations began to sort of take hold and take shape to sort of deal with some of these ideas in their communities. And I just want to give you a sort of a few examples that I brought out of my This Lead is Killing Us exhibition. The student organization for urban leadership, known as SOUL in 1964, was a youth organization populated mostly by high school and college age children or students in the Chicago area, who mobilized around this idea of lead exposure, sort of pressuring the city of Chicago and politicians, but also sort of the federal government to provide lead abatement procedures or programs for inner city communities, but also to sort of increase the level or number of clinics that students and people in Chicago, residents and citizens in Chicago would have access to. Next slide, please. The Citizens Committee to End Lead Poisoning was another organization in 1965 in Chicago, and they would sort of go around and test the blood and sort of collect urine from residents in Chicago's housing projects. And they would take them to sort of the Cook County Hospital or other clinics to have them measured for lead, and use this as a way of sort of gaining or sort of providing awareness to residents about the dangers of lead, of peeling cracked lead paint in their vicinity. They sort of submitted sort of petitions to the city government and to the state of Illinois, but also handed out brochures to residents on the streets as sort of a grassroots sort of foot activism. Next slide, please. Dorothy Trice, who was a nurse and physician in New York City. She was sort of physician trained at the Medical College of Philadelphia. She worked in the New York City Public Health Department from 1959 until she retired in 1979. But she was very active in this conversation around lead and lead poisoning. And it's important to also understand the role of other organizations in places like New York City as well. Well known is the Black Panther Party's free medical clinics mobilizing around such illnesses as sickle cell disease, diabetes. But the Black Panther Party was also very vocal around this issue of lead poisoning in chapters like Seattle, which was one of the first chapters outside of Oakland. Coming off of the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords Party, which was an organization that was founded in Chicago and sort of open chapters in New York City and sort of a Puerto Rican sort of activist organization. They also spearheaded a lead poisoning sort of program in New York City that in many ways sort of would come on the offensive or come on the heels of their well-known garbage offensive in the 1970s. So these were sort of questions and issues that sort of many people in many different places were sort of mobilizing around in the 1960s and 1970s. Next slide, please. This is just an image of Kenneth Calhoun, who was testing a child for lead poisoning in 1974. So again, you see from this image sort of the emphasis on children in these places, but also how a number of different sort of activists from different spaces, different communities, different organizations mobilized around this issue of lead and lead poisoning. And these ideas do not just come out of the blue and come out of a vacuum. Next slide, please. So I'm a cultural historian, so I'm always sort of thinking about ways of knowing, thinking about how we can sort of bring these ideas front and center from sort of individuals and scholars and sort of activists and entertainers that sort of get our point across in a way that sort of traditional sources may not. And so Jimmy Collier, who's a well-known folklorist who sometimes opened for Martin Luther King in certain venues, had a song called "Lead Poison on the Wall," which I think sort of encapsulates, some of these broader ideas of this movement. So his "Lead Poison on the Wall." kills little guys and little dolls. It kills them big and it kills them small while we stand by and watch them fall. And the landlord does nothing to stop it all. That death on the wall. So here he is, in many ways, describing sort of the complicity of sort of landlords of sort of the housing industry, but also that death on the wall that encapsulates the experiences and lives of people living in apartments and other sort of situations where they cannot control their immediate environment. And so this becomes an important sort of conversation around lead and lead abatement programs, but also the politics of housing. Next slide. So again, this question continues to evolve on sort of chronic lead exposure. By the 1970s, Richard Nixon passes this Lead Abatement Act, which is supposed to significantly reduce the amount of paint in people's homes, but it's sort of limited at best. But you continue to have these conversations around how much exposure to lead is suitable. And over the course of the 20th century, painfully slow, we get to the point where we now know, of course, that there is no amount of exposure to lead which is acceptable. Next slide. And so this is my final slide, which is part of my long-term research, but also my teaching, which is that, of course, the history of environmental experimentation does not begin and end with Tuskegee. Medical experimentation dates back to the antebellum period and slavery and experimentation on enslaved children through the 1920s, in which children in Laos Station, Indiana, were undergoing radiation experimentations on their head and scalps. Through this, in many ways, little known experimentation by the Kennedy Krieger study at Johns Hopkins University, in which they deliberately exposed 108 families and their children in particular to differing levels of lead over the course of years in the 1990s to see how each child responded to various amounts of lead in their environment. Two families, once these sort of stories became known, would sue the Kennedy Krieger Institute and make the case that the Kennedy Center and Johns Hopkins did not tell them what the study was or what they were intending to do with the study. They did not tell them that they were sort of deliberately exposing them to lead in leaded environments. And the entirety of the program was not made visible and not made accessible to a wide range of people. This was a moment in which Johns Hopkins had to sort of respond in the court of law and sort of justify this exposure, this willful exposure of children to lead and lead poisoning. And in 2001, in a strongly worded opinion in the Maryland Court of Appeals, the judge noted that children in our society are not the equivalent of rats, hamsters, and monkeys. And so in ruling for the children and their families in a little known suit, the court acknowledged this long history of medical experimentation, highlighting Tuskegee, but also the medical experimentation of soldiers during World War II and other sort of unethical moments in the historical past. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both for your presentations. You guys touched on a lot of things there, and I have a few questions. But Dr. Mizelle, I'd like to ask you, with you said the courts acknowledged and awarded them, and Ben also focused on this area where there was acknowledgement and the EPA stepped in and was removing soil. But are any of these solutions enough for the kind of exposure that the children and the families are getting? Lead exposure, is removing the soil enough? Was there any financial compensation for any of these families after this acknowledgement?
Were you asking me that question?
For both of you.
For both of us. Okay. To my knowledge, there's no financial compensation yet for these families, even though obviously there should be. I don't know that this American Lead Corporation exists anymore or in any form that someone could sue them. But I certainly think that the federal government owes these families quite a lot, certainly.
And the soil removal, has that been seen to be enough?
They are still doing periodic testing there. I think they're going to find, this is my prediction, they'll find that it's even more widespread than they knew. Just the way that lead spreads through different medium, through air and water and soil and so forth. I think it's probably an extensive problem there in Martindale Brightwood, but also throughout the urban core of a lot of these kind of old industrial cities like Indianapolis and throughout the country, throughout the world, really. It's a much more kind of insidious problem than people realize, especially in the soil, but other means too.
Richard, do you have a response as well?
No, it's not enough, and I think that is part of what the court was saying, that this sort of unethical treatment of Black children was done because of their unique particular vulnerability, right? So there was, as sort of many have argued, there was no moment in which non-Black, particularly white children, would have been exposed to this type of experimentation. But there's this sort of question of, that sort of politicians raise, which is abatement is expensive, right? And abatement is expensive. But we've known about the dangers of lead and lead poisoning for a century. So it has to do with sort of willpower and political expediency and sort of mobilization around these ideas. It can be done, and it has been done in other places. It's expensive, but with sort of the willpower, it can be done. And so exposing children to lead in that particular moment was beyond unethical.
Thank you. We have a question from BGC Professor Jennifer Mass.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So Benjamin and Richard, thank you so much for your fascinating and important work. I really enjoyed your presentations. And I was curious in terms of, when we teach about lead and environmental justice now, we talk about how GM introduced tetraethyl lead as an anti-knocking agent in the 1920s, even though ethanol, they already knew they had a perfectly good anti-knocking agent, but they couldn't make any money off of it. But they could patent the tetraethyl lead and have DuPont produce it for them and make money off of it. And so you see the communications now when we study this between GM and Irénée DuPont talking about how toxic this material was in the 1920s. So my question is, in the 60s and 70s, did people understand that this was really all done as a matter of profit and not as necessity?
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
No, you can. I was still pondering.
No, I mean, I think that this is where sort of the power of the lead industry really comes into play, right? They were nothing short of masterful in sort of creating a sort of counter knowledge or sort of frustrating sort of knowledge about lead's danger within our society. And some of these documents have only recently become disclosed and sort of described by David Rosner and Gerald Markowitz in their work. But if you look at some of those documents, you see this sort of willful hiding of information that sort of makes it difficult for sort of the public to sort of understand, some of these broader narratives of lead poisoning, but also the history of sort of the danger around sort of lead poisoning. Even in the example that I provide in 1924, you're still hard pressed to find a lot of information about those 5 workers who died and some of these other moments, because the lead industry sort of worked hard to suppress that information. And so that's in many ways part of the legacy and the history of lead and lead poisoning even to this very day.
And I would just add to that, thank you for that great question. I think what you described is precisely why I'm using the theoretical framework that I'm using, based in kind of this critical theory model of questioning the role of capitalism in creating these larger scale meta processes that Polito described. Absolutely critiquing capitalism and its role in creating and perpetuating environmental racism and lead pollution is absolutely the right way to think about it, just because of what you described.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for the question, Jen. Actually, a few weeks back, we had a program called Beautiful and Deadly, and it's about Majolica and toxic materials in fine art. And what we were kind of talking about and pulling on, it's something that you touched on here, is this awareness kind of all along that the lead is toxic, but the capital gain being more important than the fact that workers are being poisoned by the Majolica they were making. And we know now that in Majolica pieces, the lead does not leach off of this. So if you have a Majolica piece that's been fired, you do not have any risk of lead exposure versus the lead exposure that the dippers were having. So I say all this to say, we know about this continued knowledge of the dangers of lead and on marginalized communities. For Majolica, we were looking at women and children really experiencing the impacts. And here we're looking at Black communities. I'd be really interested also to know if children are disproportionately affected versus adults. But why are we still dealing with these issues if we have known for so long? And I think Dr. Mizelle started to touch on this. It wouldn't happen if it wasn't Black families, but if you guys could just expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are a lot of things at play here. I think it's, the aforementioned sort of lead industry that has sort of suppressed this information, but I also think it's, and this is me sort of tapping into my, medical historian hat, there's still this sort of nagging desire for physicians and scholars in society to want to pinpoint disease, under a microscope, right? We have to be able to see visibly a virus or some other sort of pathogen or entity to sort of mobilize around, these ideas. And so, lead is different. It demands a certain kind of measurement. It demands a certain kind of sort of thinking about the body in certain environments. Sort of more wealthy people can change their environment so that they're not as exposed to lead. So it's still a disease of in many ways, race and poverty. And so when you sort of couple the fact that it's a disease of race and poverty with this still overall lack of or unwillingness for medical scholars and physicians to sort of think about environmental diseases and sort of mobilize around environmental diseases. I think that's why it is still an issue. And we haven't sort of thought about it in the way that we have, for example, cancer or even sort of slowly diabetes. And it demands a change in our sort of idea or ideology of disease and illness and wellness.
I would just add from my research and my understanding that a big part of the problem is that as I mentioned, it's just so pervasive. Lead is everywhere. There's, of course, trace amounts in the environment occurring naturally, but there are lead hotspots where you see much higher parts per million. And it's often in these kind of older, disinvested communities where people can't get loans to fix up their houses and remove the lead paint, to replace the lead fixtures, to cover the bare soil in their yards necessarily. And so you see these problems concentrated in these historically disinvested, chronically disinvested communities, and where people can't get homes and or can't get money to fix up their homes. And just like Dr. Mizelle was saying, it tends to be these lower income Black communities that are disproportionately impacted by this. Well, I had a question for Dr. Mizelle, if I could. Nadia, you were talking a little bit about the role of the workers in the Majelica factories and the way they were disproportionately impacted. And I wondered if you knew anything about kind of the if Black workers were disproportionately exposed to lead polluting jobs in the period that you've studied, if kind of the role of labor and lead pollution and race was a factor, if you had any insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that Markowitz and Rosner talk about this a little bit. You know, interestingly enough, some of these jobs could be difficult for Black laborers to get in certain places in the early 20th century, even though they were dangerous. But definitely, some of these sort of trades that were exposed to lead, were an issue for Black laborers, and their experiences, I think, are even more difficult to bring out of the historical record than even immigrant communities, immigrant sort of workers in these places. So I think that there's still so much that we can do, particularly around the civil rights movement, but also sort of the early history of labor, occupational health. Alice Hamilton, she focused on immigrant, but mostly, Southern Eastern European immigrants. And she does not write as much about Black laborers in these spaces, which was, not all that atypical from some progressive era reformers of the era, right? So I think your question is important, and I think that's something we also need to pull out of the narrative as well.
Thank you. There's a comment from Danny Callahan. Hi, Danny. It says, thank you, Richard. 1990 test exposure sounds outrageous. 1990, for goodness sake, which got me thinking about kind of these, and Richard, you touched on them a few times, like Tuskegee. I think when we talk about lead, we think about Flint, Michigan again. Benjamin, we usually think about, or at least I do, lead being in water, in paint. You mentioned soil, but can you talk to us a little bit about the other ways that lead contamination happens?
Sure. So obviously the most common way for lead to get into people's homes and in their environments is through the water or the soil or the dust or paint. But I think one way, for instance, that people maybe don't understand how it got there in the first place, but if you take a step back, you'll understand. If you look at just using Indianapolis as an example, historically redlined neighborhoods, and you look at a map of that and you overlay a map of where the interstate system runs now through this city. We have Interstate 65 going north-south, 70 running east-west, and it's an exact match for where these redline neighborhoods are. And so the interstates were built mid-century, when leaded fuel was still allowed. So these communities are bisected by the interstates. So there's actually a physical, literal rupture in these communities because of the interstate. And also they are situated very closely to these cars going by, emitting this exhaust with lead particulates in it. And so the lead goes into the air and lands on people's houses or lands in their yards. It gets washed out by the rain into their yards. And so it's a very tricky thing to kind of pinpoint the cause of that. But we know now, based on some scientific data, that that's how the lead got there in the first place. So that's just one example of how it can happen.
I probably have a bigger question about what can we even do to combat this? I know that a lot of it is the knowledge I know that water filters are a really big thing in areas where the contamination is happening in water, but is there something we can do to combat?
Well, probably the simplest thing you can do is if you get a positive test in your yard and find out you have lead, is just cover the bare soil. Don't let kids play in dirt. If you garden, make a raised bed. There are some very simple measures like that. Plant some flowers lay down some mulch and so forth. There's a lot of kind of activity in Indianapolis now around raising environmental awareness, getting people in communities involved in kind of speaking out on their own behalf, marshaling government resources to fix these problems. But it takes a lot of grassroots efforts. I think we're at the beginning.
So can I ask a follow-up question to that, to Ben? So, we were talking about the other day, sort of this, similar to how we talk about, medical experimentation beginning and ending with Tuskegee, and that not being the case. We often sometimes think of Flint as sort of the beginning and ending of these sort of conversations. I've noticed that, more recently, when I bring up Flint in my classrooms, the students are, not as well versed as they used to be on sort of the particulars of Flint, as opposed to 5 years ago when I would bring this up in class. And it's something similar happened, of course, with Katrina. Students now really know very little about Katrina. I mean, it might as well have been in the 19th century, right, for some of them. So my question to you is, how do we sort of acknowledge Flint, but also sort of think about the importance of getting everyone to understand that Flint is not the only example of this occurring within our society? That, as you said so eloquently the other day, there are thousands of Flints, right? So how do we move beyond this Flint as sort of this important touchstone to a broader movement, I guess?
Right. And that's such a terrific question. I think using Flint as a starting point of saying, like, look, this is a problem. It got a lot of national attention, reminding people about it, conveying the history of how it got to where it was. Polito talks about it. I know I keep referencing her, but she's done such good work, as an experiment in neoliberal governance, where this racialized space was used as a sacrifice zone in this experiment of neoliberal governance. And so using that to explain how this is happening elsewhere, I think, is such an important tool, using that kind of theoretical framework. And it really, I think, like the example with Martindale Brightwood, the only way they were able to get any remediation funding from the federal government was because people raised hell and wouldn't quiet down even when people wanted them to. This pastor and this woman started this environmental justice collaborative. And it takes, I think, there are 1,000 different Flints, so there need to be 1,000 different grassroots organizations. So I think, my kind of pie in the sky idea, being a publicly engaged scholar, is I'll be able to, get in every community where this is a problem and start this. But I think it takes a lot of different people, a lot of different hands involved to make any sort of progress.
Jennifer Mass would like to ask another question. So Jen, whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you, Nadia. This is a question for both Richard and Benjamin again. I mean, we always get it drilled into us at the beginning of talking about environmental justice issues that correlation does not equal causation, and yet there's some incredibly powerful data for basically everyone in the United States, and looking at how our average IQs change when tetraethyl lead first enters the environment, and then when we stop using leaded gasoline. And so we see the IQ issue being kind of settled there, but what I'm concerned about is the lead paint in inner cities. And we know that the neurological damage on children is profound, and it can lead to lower IQs. And so I wanted to ask if you knew of any early intervention programs for children that were living in these polluted environments in places like Baltimore.
the earliest that I can think of really is the example that I gave, and I guess that's not really around children particularly. And again, I'm sort of not the expert on this that Benjamin is, but I do think that there was sort of a mobilization to sort of temporarily end these sort of discarding of sort of used batteries in inner city Baltimore, or sort of East Baltimore at this time. But the sort of narrative of sort of chronicity that I sort of described was not really sort of described in that way, in the 1920s and really 1930s and 1940s. So from my perspective, from what I can tell of the record, I see these, ideas sort of really sort of formulating in the 1950s and 1960s when these sort of smaller organizations began to take shape and really sort of test the resolve of sort of these broader ideas of sort of lead and lead poisoning and sort of the political will to deal with them in many ways unsuccessfully, but also laying the groundwork or framework for later activism around these ideas.
I think you used an interesting phrase just now, the political will. So one of the things that Indiana is doing, and I can speak to what's happening right now, less so historically, but just in the last legislative session, or maybe the one before that, the state government passed a law that would require lead testing of school-age children. So blood testing to see exposure. But this bill didn't really get any traction until the rich white legislators realized that maybe their kids were being impacted, that these kind of in these old buildings, these expensive private schools, they might also have lead in their pipes or lead in their paint. And that suddenly raised the alarm that, oh, we do need intervention, early intervention at school. We need to do lead testing for every kid in school. And that's, I mean, it's good that the bill passed, but it's a problem that that's what it took to get it passed. Instead of people had been saying for decades, we need to test kids in school. The earlier you catch it, the better. And there are certain health things that you can do. You can, adjust diet to kind of get the lead out of your body because it lives in your bones. And if you can eat certain things to get it out of your body. But the sooner you start on that, the better. So it's just sort of interesting to see how that played out and what the political will it took to actually get it done. It's rather unfortunate.
Thank you both so much for your thoughts on that. I think it's interesting, Benjamin, that the Kennedy Krieger Institute or Foundation still exists. And I don't think if it had been white children that they were poisoning, that they would necessarily be around anymore. And so I think the difference that you raise is an important one in terms of getting these types of policies made and getting some accountability for these situations. Thank you.
Yeah, Kennedy Krieger still exists, absolutely. And sort of a well-known sort of institute still within Johns Hopkins. But I would also say, just sort of on the heels of that, I mean, these sort of questions of lead and what some scholars have described as agnotology or ignorance making, or the act of unknowing, in some ways sort of parallels the long history of the tobacco industry and sort of other sort of toxic exposures. And so there's a blueprint for, in many ways, lead and lead poisoning in the lead industry for frustrating this knowledge and frustrating this information. In many ways, that's really an important part of this story. I keep harping on it, but why we don't know what we don't know about lead poisoning and sort of the ignorance making that continues to this very day is an important part of the story.
So we'll take one last question, and this is from Danny Callahan, and not at all a basic question because I have the same question. Does lead exposure impact, is it passed on genetically from parents to children? And Jen, feel free to jump in if you have an answer as well.
Well, I've read that there are some questions that are unanswered about the epigenetics, and that's something I'm not prepared to talk about, because I don't know, but I think that is an interesting way of thinking about it, maybe the epigenetic effects of it. But also, I've read that it can if lead pollution or lead poisoning is in the mother, it can be passed through pregnancy, through the placenta and so forth. So that's kind of a frightening thought. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would sort of reiterate that. I mean, I've read similar sort of stories that I haven't delved too much into in terms of the scholarship, but sort of epigenetics in some of the same way that, stress, can be passed on, from mother to fetus and sort of impact pregnancy rates and sort of prenatal care, but also early preterm deliveries. You see some of these same questions or ideas around sort of overexposure to lead in the form of mother to child.
And I'll chime in here. This is Jennifer again, with the proviso that I'm a chemist and not a biologist, but there's, I see two different factors at work here. One is the factor of growing up in an unstable household where you have a parent or two parents who have been poisoned and their IQs are depressed and they have neurological damage as a result of that. And so that gets passed on to the children, whether anything is chemically passed on to the children or not. They just wind up in a different type of household that they might have been in had their parents not had these exposures. And then my most recent reading of the literature when it comes to lead toxicity and IQ is that they are starting to see the beginnings of an epigenetic effect, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen, and thank you all. This was a fantastic conversation, and I really wish it could go on and on. I'm really interested in environmental justice. So thank you both for joining us and adding this lens to our exhibition, Megalomania. Thank you all for attending, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.